Hyperborean Radio proudly presents Kulturkampf, a podcast dedicated to philosophy, literature, and culture. This is Titus. Welcome to episode 58, where we will be discussing Julius Evola's Ride the Tiger. Joining me in the Camara Stellata, we have Leto. Hello, sir.
Glad to be here.
Glad that you are here. And joining us once again, our good friend, Survive the Jive. Thank you for joining us again, sir.
Good to be back, Titus. Thanks for having me.
No worries, no worries. Well, let us jump right ahead into the text. Leto, you care to begin with in the world where God is dead?
So we're going to skip the introduction and just move straight into the book. We should clarify first the purpose of this book. Instead of an overview of history, Evola from the beginning of the book already acknowledges the circumstances in which we are currently living. So this book acts as a guide and critique of the modern world for those differentiated men who cannot find any stability within it. From the text. All that remains real is what has been negated or rejected from the point of view of the other, superior world of God, and truth, the world of what ought to be, not what is. The conclusion is that what ought to be is not, what is what ought not to be. This is what Nietzsche called the tragic phase of nihilism. It is the beginning of the misery of man without God. Existence seems devoid of any meaning, any goal. No God ever controlled man. Divine despotism is a fantasy. The true and essential foundation of this whole system is the particular inner structure, the capacity of recognition, and the various inborn interests of a type of man who nowadays has virtually disappeared. Man, at a given moment, wanted to be free. He was allowed to be so, and he was allowed to throw off the chains that did not bind him so much as sustain him. Thereupon, he was allowed to suffer all the consequences of his liberation, following ineluctably up to his present state in which God is dead. The question Evola addresses is not one of faith, but of existence. What is man's purpose in a world where God is dead? The target audience is neither specifically Christian nor atheist, but men who do not concern themselves and are in fact repulsed by the modern man's methods and reasons employed to sustain existence. Neither the atheistic interpretation of life nor the modern position of Christianity or paganism comes close to providing an answer to an existential angst. So we should probably just begin with what our positions already are on this to the audience. So I would put myself in the atheist category, but not necessarily from like an anti-Christian or an anti-religion perspective, just something growing up in the world and kind of losing interest with Christianity from kind of going up in school and just moving to an atheist position. And this is, I think, kind of like a target audience, people who can't seem to find a reason. They can't like find any reason in Christianity, yet they don't believe there is they don't believe purely in the material world.
Yeah, I would sort of my growth or journey into spiritualism kind of mirrors yours. I was raised Catholic, raised in a strict Catholic upbringing, went to Catholic primary school and secondary school, and sadly, I lost my faith, and I was unfortunately one of those millennials who drank deep from the new atheist movement that started popping up around George W. Bush's presidency, and I think sort of the cult of evangelicism and the backlash to it had a huge impact, not only on the movement but on myself as well, because I felt that with the Iraq War and all of what was going on, sort of the being snarky and being nihilistic about spirituality was vogue, but also it was sort of a safe avenue for rebellion. But getting into the dissident right and growing up, I'd say that I'm no longer an atheist. I'd probably be a deist, and currently I'm getting into sort of the Vedic traditions and esoteric Hitlerism, where I hope to become a firm believer of that in time.
I have quite a similar narrative of going from a Catholic upbringing, then in that the turn of the millennium, there was the whole atheist thing, and I was a big part of, well, not a part of, rather, I was sold on that, and very anti-Christian in that sense, and carried on for that for a long time until by the time I graduated from university, I decided to read Nietzsche, and that was a wake up for me because it was a criticism of Christianity that wasn't a moral criticism. It was a new type of criticism, and it raised excellent questions. I was very much into existentialism and existential literature, but Nietzsche is distinguished from them in the fact that has an aristocratic bearing, an aristocratic perspective in a way, and his disdain his contempt for Christianity is from a totally different perspective. It isn't a moralizing perspective. It's one that transcends morals. I also very much agree with Evela's opinion on Nietzsche, his positions on the limitations of Nietzsche. But for me, interestingly, it was reading Nietzsche that set me on a path to become a pagan within a year or two of starting to read Nietzsche, because of the way he set up the dichotomy of the Apollonian and the Dionysian, using these kind of classical concepts, and himself, he was a classicist. It made me think of a different way of seeing values in the world other than those that I had inherited from my Christian upbringing. And that was probably far more a significant change in my life than the change from Catholicism to atheism, because all the while I had been an atheist, I had carried within me many of the morals of a Christian, which is exactly what Nietzsche was criticizing. But while many Nietzscheans were left-wing atheists, I thought that there could be another route, and Evela, I think, is a thinker who actually deals with that alternative route.
Yeah, well said. I just kind of like, I don't want to put myself as like trying to be like I agree with Titus. Most of my upbringing is like simply going with the grain. Like there wasn't really intellectual thought into it until like much later within life. I'll move on with the next paragraph. The crisis is thus presented exclusively as one of values and ideals serving as a superstructure to that system, which, having become hypercritical and deceptive, had nothing more to do with the practical conduct of individuals or with the driving forces of the epoch. Humanity's existential lesion is generally explained as an effect of material economic organization in a society such as the capitalistic one. The true remedy, the start of a new and authentic humanism, a human integrity, and a happiness never known before, would then be furnished by the system of a different socio-economic system, by the abolition of capitalism, and by the institution of a communist society of workers. Just pause from the text here. Even though Evola is directly addressing communism, the reasoning is exactly that of liberalized socialism. Now that the void for the removal of God has become overbearing in society, man is in search of a reason to exist and overcome the meaningless nihilistic stage. Drastic attachments to ideologies which promote the new human become the justification for the most absurd ideologies, either it be the socio-economic myth, the embodiment of Nietzsche's last man, the society of workers, or the multicultural man. Returning to Evola, the time is near of the most despicable of men, who can no longer despise himself. The last man of the tenacious and polluting race. The individual in contemporary consumer society reckons that it would be too expensive, indeed absurd, to do without the comfort and well-being that this evolved society offers him, merely for the sake of an abstract freedom. Thus, he accepts with a good grace all the levelling conditions of a system. For want of anything else, it calls on the abject minorities of outsiders, on the excluded and rejected, sometimes even on the third world, and on the blacks as being the only revolutionary potential. In all of this, it confirms in another way the general nihilistic character of the epoch.
Great quote.
Yes.
I used that exact quote in 2011 on a video I filmed on the 8th of August 2011 when the race riots in London happened, which I was standing among them. I filmed them all, and that quote was buzzing around in my head. So I finished that quote. I finished the video with that quote. And then the BBC actually said they wanted to use that video at one point, but then I think they figured out that quote at the end. Maybe they didn't like my position. But it was really, I think that it explains some of the ideologies that dominated now, and then the obsession with third worldism and revolutionary potential.
Well, it's a quest for authenticity, right? I mean, this is, I think, the sort of the clearest sort of way to dissect this yearning from secularized society is a longing for the real, and because the average bugman, well, or not, rather, even like the average bugman, an individual, a shitlib who has the ability to sort of step outside the bounds of base materialism and consumption, obviously is trying to seek for something greater and truer than that, and the only avenues afforded to them are third worldism at this point, and communism.
It's very similar to Heidegger and authentic and inauthentic existence, and just like the result outcomes of taking into authentic existence and just attaching oneself to something crazy, something just ridiculous in society. Do we have any more comments, or I'll continue on? We have a lot to read, so we can kind of go through it fast.
Yeah, let's keep going.
Yeah. Following the socio-economic man, Evola wishes to draw our attention to a much different process, active nihilism. Firstly, his description of Nietzsche's Superman. There are those who not only admit that the process of dissolution are reversible and that there is no going back, but who would not want to follow the path even if it existed. They willingly accept their condition of being without support or roots. Then the problem arises of how far the negative can be transformed into something positive. Nietzsche showed that the point at which one realizes that God is dead, that the whole world of spirit, of good and evil, is only an illusion, and that the only true world is that which was neglected or rejected in the name of the former, is the crux of the decisive test. The weak shatter, the strong destroy, and what does not shatter them, while the stronger still go beyond the values that once served them. This leads to reversal of perspectives. Nihilism at the point appears as a sign of strength, signifying that the power to create to will has developed far enough that one has no further need for this general interpretation of existence, of the introduction of a meaning. It is a measure of one's strength of will to know how far one can do without the meaning to things, how far one can bear to live in a meaningless world. But then one will organize part of it. If at first man needed a god, now he is thrilled with a universal godless disorder, with a world of chance where the fearful, the ambiguous, and the seductive are part of his very existence. The problem of the meaning of life is thus resolved with the affirmation that life is and can be value in itself. After recognizing that nothing exists, all is permitted. The inevitable consequence challenge. The inevitable challenge. Now prove the nobility of your nature. And Evola follows with his critique. The negative destructive phase of Nietzsche's thought ends with the affirmation of immanence. In its turn, the essence of life is the will to power. One can see that Nietzsche's nihilism stops halfway. It sets up a new table of values, including a good and an evil. It presents a new idol with dogmatic affirmation, whereas in reality, this ideal is only one of the many that could take shape in life, and which is not in fact justified in and of itself. Without a particular choice and without faith in it, the fact that the fixed point of reference set up beyond nihilism lacks a true foundation, so long as one insists on pure eminence, is already apparent in Nietzsche's historical criticism. The entire world of high values is interpreted there as reflecting a decadence, but at the same time these values are seen as the weapon of a hidden will to power on the part of a certain human group. which has used them to hamper another group, whose life and ideals resembled those of the Supermen. This instinct of decadence itself is then presented as a special variety of the will to power. Okay, now, so we're going to dissect those last couple sentences to help the listeners. The line, the entire world of higher values is interpreted there as reflecting a decadence, is a direct reference to Christian slavist Nietzsche and Master Morality. Under Nietzsche's conception of history, man naturally has a will to power, or warrior worldview. The priest has tricked the warrior into believing that he may achieve salvation through negation of warrior ethos, such as the will to power. What resulted was a decadence and lowering of the warrior man, but a reverse superiority of the priest. Hence the instinct of decadence itself is then presented as a special variety of the will to power for the priest. Now returning to the text. Now it is obvious in function of will to power all distinctions vanish. There are no more supermen or sheepmen, neither affirmers or negators of life. There's only a variety of techniques, of means tending to make one human class or another prevail. Why should decadence be an evil? It is all life, and all justifiable in terms of life. If this is truly taken in its irrational naked reality outside and any theology or teleology as Nietzsche would have wished, once again, all ground gives way. Nietzsche, moreover, wants to restore its innocence to becoming by freeing it from all finality and intentionality. Same Nietzsche who had justly criticized and rejected evolutionism and Darwinism because he could see that the higher figures and types of life are only sporadic and fortuitous cases. The second point is the pure affirmation of life does not necessarily coincide with the will to power in a strict sense, qualitative sense, nor with the affirmation of the Superman.
Well, I think it might be good for us to sort of briefly mention Nietzsche and nihilism here. We have yet to cover Nietzsche on Kulturkampf, and he is someone that we will be exploring in full detail. But perhaps we should mention just sort of the basics between active and passive nihilism. Just for as an explainer here, because sort of the popular definition, when one hears the term nihilism, is actually the passive state of nihilism, which is basically nothingness as an end. Whereas Nietzsche's active nihilism is a transition from meaninglessness to rendering meaning via the will to power or via actions of the heroic.
Hence, you kind of get this view of he's not a nihilist because he overcame nihilism.
Yes.
Forth.
Yes.
But the main the reasoning he gives for overcoming nihilism is will to power as this affirmation of oneself to become something, and we'll see. Kind of Avola's criticism is this will to power will just result in something that is destructive and reckless. It's a bit crazy. It's like
well, it dissolves into barbarism, right?
Into Machiavellian territories and stuff like that.
Yeah.
That's his main criticism he has here. But I think that what should be taken from Nietzsche is like he wrote his passages in a time where like the will to power was seen as something like as someone was just subordinated to upper Christianity, Christian like morals and stuff. And what I get about it is like the beauty of power and this self affirmation of a human being to become something.
I could say that there's something. Count Kalergi's writings on Nietzsche and also his writings in general are quite pertinent to bring up at this point, I think, because on the one hand he described Nietzsche's morality as unique among European history because it was the first heathen moralizer since antiquity, and in the sense that, well, I guess he's saying that this pure will to power was at odds with Jewish thought, or what he called Jewish thought. He also thought that the Jews were a very good force in Europe, and he thought that all Christian thought was essentially Jewish in character, and that the Jews had rightfully, I'm talking about Kalergi here, but Nietzsche said something similar. He said the Jews had, the Jews would emerge as an aristocracy in the new Europe of Kalergi's dreams, the idea of a united mixed race Europe. And Kalergi was a Nietzschean. So he was of an aristocratic background, of mixed race. He had some Japanese ancestry and Austrian ancestry, and he was the godfather of the EU, and he believed in this like will to power as being the ultimate thing. And he gave the example of the Jews who freed themselves from the ghettos of Europe to become the masters of the world, and as an example of a perfect Nietzschean people. And Nietzsche himself had some praise to give to the Jewish European Jews for the same similar reasons. Yeah. Although he's also called an anti-Semite for other writings that he'd done. But the point here is that what is will to power without the guiding path of traditions and the continuity with the ways of your ancestors? It could be a very destructive and nihilistic force. And that's what I tried to say in my video about Nietzsche. I did one in the summer, which is like, even if you're not a crazy, EU maniac or something, you can do, and this is a really heroic path of your life through sheer will to power, but it kind of is still nihilistic when it's just it occurs in a void. It occurs in a void. What does it matter if you get to Mars in a completely empty, voidless, meaningless universe? It isn't really an answer to the existential crisis of the existentialists were positing. And although some like Sartre tried to answer this with saying, you should just become a communist or something. It isn't. It's a cop out. Yeah. It doesn't really answer any those the problems and those sensations of meaninglessness. And the question was posed earlier, like, will your nature, the noble nature, be revealed in light of the void before you, of the abyss? But I think, there is something true to that, because how, if when freed from the constraints of an authority, will you then behave like an animal? Well, that would betray a very slavish nature, that you require the constant threat of punishment to behave in a noble way. But also the absence of a guiding authoritative path, even if it isn't a personified god of the conventional sort, that still leads to a quite an empty existence, although it can be partially filled with a symbolic act of will to power.
I'm a bit biased in the sense of being kind of inspired by Jonathan Bowden, who's really adopted the Nietzschean will to power. But hypothetically, you're in like a situation where you really have such little connections to any tradition. This time of taking this kind of Superman ideology as a method is like moving through the modern world. It seems like a valid form, but with flaws.
Well, I think I
don't have a problem with it.
I think you hit upon something that is very important. Viewing Nietzsche and his philosophy as a tool is I think what the largest thing that I take away from Nietzsche is that it's a way, but not sort of the means in and of itself, right? And that's sort of where I sort of have issues with people who just sort of go full on Nietzschean, because I do think that, if you stare into the void and there's nothing there, what matters is what you as a person or as a people are truly deep down inside, because it's like you can say, the Jews do display very true Nietzschean elements to their character. The problem is that they're a group of sociopaths, and their sort of actions reflect that. So,
My just sorry to interrupt, but
yeah.
just remembering reading genealogy and Mollers, does he put forth like this kind of like economic kind of will to power as something productive? Nietzsche, I thought he seems to focus much more on like a brutal like kind of strength, not through like almost through violence kind of nature and through affirmations, a Dionysian kind of way, not so much this economic put forth. I think it's kind of like a kind of one way you can take Nietzsche, but it's a bit of an abomination.
Oh well, dude, you can hear you can read essays about sort of the Nietzschean sort of perspective of transgendered people, right? I mean that's
There's so many interpretations.
yeah, that's the issue with Nietzsche, is that you can sort of, you know, you can glom it onto anything.
Everyone says, "Oh, they haven't understood Nietzsche correctly," and like that is just such a typical thing to say among philosophy students. Like, if you don't interpret Nietzsche the way I did, it's because you haven't correctly understood it, or the way my professor understood it, or whatever. But of course, Nietzsche himself deliberately contradicts himself, and he's often sort of trolling in a way, like he's trying to like push, prod people. Like he says, that which is falling should be pushed. He is basically saying like he values strength and over weakness. So that's why he's against socialism and Christianity, which he sees as getting weak. But he's also against nationalism, and he also had funny ideas about. He definitely believed in aristocracy, but he also believed in perhaps the virtue of a mixing of peoples and things like that. So no ideology or political perspective now could truly be, say, Nietzschean in the sense that they agree with all Nietzsche's ideas. But of course, each side will always accuse the other of misinterpreting Nietzsche.
I'm sure Nietzsche would have not known directly this criticism, but would have known the criticism of the priest. Like, this is a form of will to power, overcoming the warrior. And yeah, I think he kind of just left it out in the open. Like you said, he fills himself with contradictions. I don't think he's stupid enough to overlook something like that.
Oh, well, shall we continue, Leto?
Do you want to do the next part? And then I'll do Heidegger after that.
Sure. And I just want to see where exactly we are. This is... sorry, 1 second. Transcendent dimension?
Yeah, that's it.
All right. This is the transcendent dimension. The essential thing is that such a man is characterized by an existential dimension not present in the predominant human type of recent times, that is, the dimension of transcendence. Nietzsche's solution to the problem of the meaning of life, consisting in the affirmation that this meaning does not exist outside of life, and that life in itself is meaning, is valid only on the presupposition of being that has transcendence as its essential component. It is not only through the other dimension of that transcendence that life presents these characteristics that Nietzsche mistakenly generalizes and thinks he can attribute to when he sets up his new values. All the positive aspects of the way of the Superman belong to this transcendental dimension. And just to clarify to our listeners, in the traditional view of the world is an absurdity, since it is the result of an illusion or a fall. The task, therefore, is self-transcendence, to overcome the world. Yet Nietzsche's naturalism does not recognize any transcendence. Hence, the world can only be overcome by more power. And unfortunately, that is the unattainable task, which can only lead to insanity. I'm just going to read a little bit more from Evola here. All the positive aspects of the way of the Superman belong to this transcendental dimension, the power to make a law for oneself. the power to refuse and not to act when one is pressed to affirmation by the prodigious forces of the enormous tension. Natural and free asceticism moved to test its own strength by gauging the power of the will according to the degree of resistance, pain, and torment that it can bear in order to turn them to its own advantage. The principle of not obeying the passions but holding them on a leash. The idea that the superior man is distinguished from the inferior by his intrepidity, by his defiance of unhappiness. The responding with incredulity to those who point the way of happiness in order to make man follow a certain behavior. The recognition that of the ways to preserve a superior species of man is to claim the right to exceptional acts as attempts at victory over oneself, as acts of freedom, and to assure oneself with a sort of asceticism, a preponderance and certitude of one's own strength of will. Keeping the distance which separates us, being indifferent to difficulties, hardships, privations, even to life itself. To denounce the insidious confusion between discipline and enfeeblement, and holding that indulgence can only be attained in the case of him who has no right to it. And finally, to point the way of those who, free from all bonds, obeying only their own law, are unbending in obedience to it and above every human weakness. All these are the comprehensible and attainable when life is more than life, that is through transcendence. The transcendent dimension, which holds firm through all turns of the tide, all ups and downs, will also play the part here as a transformer. It prevents any intoxicated self-identification with the life force, not to mention what might be induced by a thirst for life or by the disorderly impulse to seek, in mere sensation, a surrogation for the meaning of existence, and to lose oneself in actions and achievements. To sum up, the man of whom the new freedom does not spell ruin, whether because, given this special structure, he himself has a firm base in himself, or because he is in the process of conquering it through an existential rupture of levels that reestablishes contact with the higher dimension of being. This man will possess a vision of reality stripped of human and moral element, free from the projections of subjectivity and from conceptual, finalistic, and theistic superstructures.
Pure Chad.
Mm-hmm.
You can see the elements in which Evola really admires within Nietzsche, but he still has to clarify why they can't work within his worldview of how the world works between the physical material world and the world of being. To him, the whole purpose of life was overcoming the physical world. And while Nietzsche finds these positive acts of being oneself, it just doesn't. Evola doesn't believe they're possible without this overcoming of what a man is. I'd somewhat agree. Like, you can't just taking these ideas out into the world and being this nihilistic, ambitious will to power. You can probably better than some certain ways of living, but ultimately something more is required of you. Like, and how to put it, like through like in order to fully understand these, you have to kind of know the deeper meaning behind them.
It's interesting to say that from that quote, the idea of someone who would basically be perfectly comfortable in the modern world, like with the death of God. So much of what we talk about is about the problems of this time, but this the ideal that being presented here is someone who can happily set up any morals that he requires, any values for himself he is his own authority. This is obviously this presents a danger for reasons we've already established. I think that Evola was right to challenge the Nietzschean view in that way. As far as I know, all the other traditionalists would completely reject Nietzsche from in every respect. Evola is the only one who would even entertain Nietzsche's ideas. Nietzsche being so intensely modernistic. So it's really interesting to see the way he accommodates the value of the Superman in a traditionalist perspective. Sorry.
Well, the Superman.
I think that's because I was just going to make a quick comment. I think that's because he has his ideal of spirituality has such a similarity or such a connection to self-affirmation.
Mm-hmm.
And I think he certainly reads into the Nietzsche.
Self-affirmation is definitely predominant.
Well, yeah, and I think he certainly reads into the archetype of the Superman as an inherently aristocratic being. And I think
they both think that.
Yeah.
They're both aristocratic in their worldviews. They're both comfortable with their own with their perceived superiority to others, and aren't don't seek to apologize for that in any way. Nietzsche explicitly talks about that as being a manifestation of the blood, which we might expect from a materialist, whereas Evola brings up the other aspects as well. The aristocrats of the soul. In fact, there is a quote from Nietzsche which criticizes people who talk about aristocracy of the soul. I think he basically is implying that the only reason they would bring up such a thing is if there was something wanting in their blood. But even Nietzsche himself was not. I think he was. I don't know how aristocratic he really was, and he was part Polish or something.
Yeah, I think which is often brought up to sort of highlight his anti-nationalism was that he was partly Polish.
He does denounce it a couple other times, but simply because it's unaristocratic, like it is. So I guess he sees it as a bit collective.
It's also it's populist. It's a populist ethos, absolutely.
Yeah, I think Evola is not so sold on nationalism either. But he was, especially later on, he was always involved with these movements, and Italian nationalists knew him, and he was socializing with them. But I don't think he was really just a nationalist. He certainly wasn't interested in mass ideas, like the idea of mass communications and converting the masses. So in the sense that Evola is here criticizing Nietzsche in a political sense, I don't know to what extent Evola is even concerned with the political perspective. Well, that was brought up before, right? Or in the notes here, that whether this criticism of Nietzsche is about the political practicality.
Yeah, that was my notes, because it's just I have the feeling of always kind of narrowing Nietzsche's view. That's all I could say about it, directing it kind of to just directly over this priest and warrior ethos. There's a lot more to Nietzsche than just this. That's my comment. Another thing, at the end of Ola, he kind of he doesn't like the term Dionysian. He proves of this Dionysian Apollonianism. He's against sort of this intoxication of life. He prefers to step back and just then be something Dionysian. It's an interesting take.
I thought he wanted to balance the Dionysian and the Apollonism, which aren't actually necessarily correct. It's not an actual dichotomy that existed in the classical world, as far as I'm aware. But he
states that as well.
Oh, does he? Who, Evola or Nietzsche?
Evola, and then he goes on to use it anyway. He doesn't care.
Yeah. I mean, it's a useful dichotomy. I mean, we recognize these as archetypes. I mean, these are quite recognizable. The ordered and the disordered, the right hand path, the left hand path, etc.
Well, for our listeners who aren't versed in that esotericism, Tom, do you care to just sort of explain right hand versus left hand path?
Okay.
Bit of a tangent, but it's worth bringing up, I think.
Well,
I could
I
give it a
don't
try and you
want.
correct me.
Haven't prepared for it, but I
Oh,
just to simplify, like the right hand path is the conventional path of tradition. Well, all both there are left hand traditionalist paths as well. The right hand path is the normal one of obeying a discipline and sticking to that, the established order, whereas the left hand path is often a way of reaching the same ends but through the complete opposite path. So, you know, I guess Dionysianism, or Bacchanalian, like through instead of through sobriety, through ritual intoxication. That might be an example. And actually, left-hand path is a big thing with people like Sticks and Hammer, 666, and that sort of crowd who. Uh, I'd say that a lot of people who call themselves left-hand path are not really left-hand path. I'm not talking about Sticks himself. I don't know much about him, but people who basically want to act in an irreligious way and call it religious. But that is not to say that the left-hand path doesn't exist. And Evola himself endorses certain elements of it and saying that there are ways to do that, but it's not. If you're if you're having some kind of uh, ritual orgy or whatever, it's not about uh, just sensations of the body. It has to be as much as much a ritual and devotion, or not devotional, but as much a transcendent act as devotional celibacy.
Mm.
I hope that was good. Now, sorry if I messed that up.
oh no. Like
No,
Crowley would be an example of left-hand
yeah.
path, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, drinking cat's blood and whatever else stuff
Yeah.
he did.
Yeah. Well, let's move on. It's an impossible to segue from cat's blood to to the next topic, but we'll endeavor. What are we doing? We're doing.
I think
Yeah,
I think I'll have to read this. I
Sure.
wrote these parts. So.
go for it, my friend.
All right. In the following chapters, Avola will address numerous modern existentialists. For the following section, we will limit our analysis to that of Heidegger. Firstly, though, I will give a brief summary of Heidegger's work, Being in Time. Heidegger puts forth two different modes of existence, inauthentic and authentic. One is that of living your life in accordance with which our genuine selves, meaning not defined or directed by outside sources, but by an inner feeling, similar to the maximum being oneself. Inauthentic existence is an inferior method of existing in which outside sources, such as the majority opinion, direct our attention or care in the world. A perfect example is exactly about our ideologies. We are not concerned of the opinions of others or how we are perceived by them. What is important is following a path which from our inner Dasein, or being, which is authentic and correct. This is an existentially superior method of existence of that compared to an inauthentic one. This is not to say that Heidegger advocates an existence in which a being specifically indulges themselves with only pleasures. As a being, you are only limited to a finite amount of time before you reach your death. A true authentic existence embraces the ever-encroaching time for death. The authentic existence acknowledges the finiteness of one's existence and encompasses their existence and world to ensure the attainment and continuation of authenticity is accomplished. A being's placement within the world is not by accident, nor should it be considered as such. A being is subject to history and should accept one's historicity, reasserting the authentic self in accordance with such. When Heidegger analyzes the being or Dasein, it is typically situational, as for example the use of a hammer. A being sees a hammer as a tool and automatically associates such tool with their use. Thus, the hammer as Dasein ontologically analyzes it exists in his world for a particular use. Say I leave the hammer within my shed and I am working within the kitchen or fixing whatever it is within the kitchen. I have a particular care for the hammer, and the hammer does not exist within my current being's world. Once I move myself from the kitchen to the shed, the hammer comes into existence within my being's world. Thus, the hammer is an extension of my being to existing within the world. There are no metaphysical abstractions, but an ontological concept of man. Now, continuing back with Evoller's criticism of Heidegger. Heidegger's existentialism is characterized by an unacceptable over-evaluation of situationality. Dasein, for Heidegger, is always being in the world. Heidegger repeats that the characteristic of being in the world is not accidental for the self. It is not as though the latter could exist without it. It is not that man firstly is and then has a relation to the world, a casual relation, occasional and arbitrary relation with that which is. All this might well be the case, but only for a human type different from that which concerns us. As we know, in the human type, an inner detachment, albeit coupled with an absolute assumption of his determined nature, limits any situational conditions and form a superior point of view, minimizes and relegates to contingency and being in the world. Thus, the eventual process of transcendence envisioned by this type of existentialism is purely horizontal, not vertical in character. As we shall see, Heidegger speaks of a horizontal ecstasy in the temporal, meaning that the entity of each of us is not temporal because it happens to find itself within history, but because it is so in its own basic nature. It is able to be solely within time. Given this anguished resort to becoming for the source of one's being, and also given the recognition of the insignificance of inauthentic existence in a life that is socialized, superficial, and mundane, we have evidently reached the extreme limit of true philosophy, the true philosophical crisis, which we could have included among the variations of modern nihilism. What in question is not being, but one of its determined modalities, recognized, willed, and assumed. Since being is the transcendent dimension is not at stake, the sense of one's own problematic nature is relativized and diffused, and one does away with the metaphysical angst that the existentialist man, having a different internal constitution, feels and indeed is bound to feel. Heidegger also speaks of having oneself before one as an inexorable enigma, of the possibility being delivered or entrusted to itself involved in a given possibility about which free will can no longer be different. Yet this author denies that there is any entity from which to derive Dasein, that is, my concrete and determined being in the world and in time. Worse yet, Heidegger can find nothing better than to revive the concept of the voice of consciousness, interpreted as a call that comes from myself and yet from above me. When I am defined by the inauthentic, anodyne exterior life and have no heart for the choice already made. The fact that Heidegger sees in this voice of consciousness an objective constitutional phenomenon of Dasein and abstains, following his phenomenological method, for interpreting it as a religious or moral sense, does not in the least affect the passivity of the experience and the relative transcendence of this voice. So this is a bit heavier to read, but if you can summarize, you go.
Isn't that last bit wrong? Because I thought that Heidegger's hard to read. I had a go at being in time, and even talking to graduates who specialized in Heidegger, it's hard for me to get my head around because of the language used. But from what I understand, there was a religious and moral element to Heidegger's concepts of being in time.
It's more agnostic, but it doesn't really. It just because it kind of flirts. Maybe because I read it and I kind of, my interpretation isn't perfect. But he kind of flirted with the idea that there is this God and there is something above, but he doesn't really. After that, because he has a really big rejection of metaphysics. Like I said, his analysis of man is completely ontological, kind of like how Descartes' famous line, "I think, therefore I am." Mm-hmm. He's in a position where he's imagining the world in this abstract form from just sitting down, whatever, in your room, and you're imagining the world. But Heidegger preferred to analyze man from his daily interactions within the world, how he works. This state of sitting down and thinking was kind of an inferior method to him.
But he was a Catholic.
Yeah, I think he was training to be a priest, but he didn't complete his studies.
And I mean, I don't. The notebooks, Heidegger's notebooks, they revealed some of his other motivations, and as I thought he was a Christian. But here he's saying here Evola is praising that uh, is he say following his phenomenological method from interpreting it in a religious or moral sense. Uh, he's thinking that's good, but even though that there is a passivity, is that right?
Just give me a sec, I'll read it. Is it the fact that Heidegger sees in the voice of conscious and objective constitutional formula of Dyson and abstains, following his phenomenological method, from interpreting it a religious or moral sense?
He likes that he abstains from being religious because Evola would see religious here as being
it's a modern religious religion. So he's against that, and he
undifferentiated.
He has problems with. He really doesn't like the modern Christian take on existentialism. He hates it, and he prefers these kind of, in a way, Dionysian existentialists which try to battle with nihilism. And you can't just plain out criticize Heidegger for having a crappy work. It's a great ontological look at the world in which man exists. But Evola's main problem is still the lack of connection to transcendence as something above the physical world. Heidegger comes to points where he kind of flirts with it, but at the same time he has a huge kind of battle against metaphysics. He doesn't like it at all.
He's trying to use the language of modernity, modern existential philosophy to talk about the existence of a transcendent world, of divinity. Yeah. But so in a way, he kind of is. There is some transcendence, but I guess it's not enough for.
Well, it's based in life. It's based towards death, which we should read the next paragraph.
Yep.
All right. Someone else want to read it?
Tom, do you want to go?
I'll go ahead.
Sure.
Transcendence, like freedom, ought to furnish existence with a foundation of calm and incomparable security, with purity, wholeness, and an absolute decisiveness in action. Instead, it feeds all the emotional complexes of man in crisis, angst, nausea, disquiet, finding his own being problematical, the feeling of an obscure guilt or fall, deracination, a feeling of the absurd and the irrational, an unadmitted solitude, an invocation of the incarnate spirit, the weight of an incomprehensible responsibility, incomprehensible because he cannot resort to overtly religious and hence coherent positions like those of Kierkegaard or Barth, where angst refers to the sentiment of the soul that is alone, fallen, and abandoned to itself in the presence of God. It is only in being that Heidegger sees the possibility of capturing this that is always escaping and fleeing for time.
Sorry to interrupt. Just it is only in depth. Heidegger, that's very important. Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you, but
it is only. Did I say only in being?
Yeah. It is only in death that Heidegger sees the possibility of capturing this.
Oh God, I don't know why I misread that. Sorry. So only in death, yes. That's why he said that we should hang around graveyards and such. Therefore, Heidegger speaks of existence in general as a being towards death, as a being for the end. Death overcomes being because it halts its constant, irremediable privation and non-totality, and offers it its very own possibility, unconditioned and insuperable. And this individual's anguish in the face of death, which deals the death blow to Dasein, is the anguish in the face of this possibility. This emotional colouring is again typical and significant, showing how the condition of passivity persists even here, in the face of that end that represents the accomplishment. Heidegger proceeds with an accusation of a form of inauthenticity and diversionary tranquilization, aimed not only at the stupid indifference to death, but also at the attitude that judges the preoccupation with death and anguish in the face of it as effeminate and cowardly, preferring to face it with impossibility. Yeah, I'm aware of this aspect. I quite agree that the sense of being in time is enhanced. The sense of Dasein is enhanced by an awareness of mortality and death.
Mm. Yeah, once you realize you only have like a finite amount of time before you eventually are erased from the existence, you have to figure out what you want to do and accomplish within this time, and essentially become that, or change your being to, or shape your being into that which you want to be. Vola's criticism is particularly, I'm not sure if I include it, on the emphasis of death. I don't, because if you put it in that sense, you're basing your life off this ever-encroaching death that's coming to you, and to Vola, death wasn't something that important under my, like, he understands the angst towards death, but he doesn't see it as like something to base your life around. His ideal is the transcendence, and that's where they have the two arguments.
Yeah, that's the differentiation between existentialism and transcendence, right? Philosophy. Yeah, I'll put in the show notes. Bodin has a fabulous talk on Heidegger and death's ontology that I will put in the show notes for folks who want to learn more about this.
I think it's interesting, like the ideas that we discussed previously about heroic life and like the disregard for the well-being of the body, like that kind of view that Evola loves is obviously somewhat contaminated by a worldview where it would be contaminated by a worldview where a morbid fear of death is always hanging over one. But that consciousness of death does have some, there is some merit to it as well. I think we could reconcile these two perspectives.
Oh, absolutely. No, and that's definitely what I was going to say, is that like a proper reading of Heidegger and sort of his view of death goes very much into, the Evolian sort of aristocratic ideal, which is, recognizing sort of your own sort of material limitations and trying to enact and become as with such potency as you possibly can muster, right? That's it's the primal drive, right? Is to live before you face oblivion.
Don't be misguided. Just like sit in your room smoking pot all day.
Right.
Go out and achieve something with your life.
Before we move to the next section, I think it's worth mentioning that Heidegger's idea is somewhat vindicated by modern science. I remember reading some social studies or psychological studies where they found out that when you tell people something, if you remind people of death, when people think about death, they immediately after, they're more likely to have right-wing feelings. The less conscious they are of death, the more susceptible they are to left-wing propaganda. And I can find the link to that study for you. It was in the mainstream news. They pathologized, of course, the right-wing views and saying that it was associated with a morbid association of death. But the more aware you are, like if they thought about dead people, dead relatives, any of something like that, or the possibility of death, then afterwards, when asked their opinions on any given social subject, they were more likely then to give a right-wing answer than if they had not previously been asked about, reminded of death.
Maybe we can make a connection between all the goths and the movement.
People who listen to heavy metal spend years fantasizing about corpses and things.
Well, embodying the right-wing view, I believe it to be a truth, and I believe we have more of an authentic existence than the average left-wing.
Yeah, well, death is a real thing. Being conscious of something that's real means being conscious of reality.
Yes.
So if to be left-wing, you need to be oblivious to one of the most obvious and defining aspects of human existence, that it is finite, then it shows that their entire worldview is based on delusional perspective.
The next paragraph, I thought it would be good to include it because I at least wanted to give some defense of Heidegger, even though we have been in this line. It's from Countercurrents. Does anyone particularly want to read it?
Sure, yeah, I'll read this. This is by Greg Johnson, Heidegger versus Evola. Evola believed that history's downward trajectory towards technological modernity and cultural decadence was a falling away from the world of being into the world of contingency. Heidegger, however, regarded Evolá's essentially Platonic outlook as part of the decline itself, indeed as a standing very close to its beginning. For Heidegger, the Platonic distillation of being as pure intelligibility and intellect, as the capacity to intuit the intelligible, is false because it is an abstraction that overlooks a more fundamental unity, a mutual belonging of historical man and meaningful worlds. For Heidegger, we are too close to things and to ourselves, too involved in them, to fully understand or control them. He believes that metaphysics posit both intelligible being and the self-transparent intellect out of the drive for mastery. Thus, the will to power that comes to fruition in global technological civilization is present at the very beginning of the metaphysical tradition. Heidegger claims that we overlook this fundamental unity because it, in effect, concealed itself. It is a historical event that cannot exist apart from man, but nevertheless was not controlled by man either. The self-concealment of being creates metaphysics, and metaphysics inaugurates the downward course of history, culminating in technological nihilism. Contra Evola, the beginning of decline is not a fall from metaphysics, but a fall into metaphysics.
I think, yeah, here you have the root of two completely different takes on history in one, which formed our. I'm more familiar with Evolas, and I embody that one more. But I think Heidegger was right in the sense that Descartes' methodology was something kind of wrong and misguided humanity. But whether or not that's the ultimate cause of our downfall, I don't really believe so. I think metaphysics and like ontological investigations both are valid methods of analysis. I know it's hard because like you two haven't read Being in Time, but do you have any like particular, just on the basic sentence, it's a fall into metaphysics rather than a fall from metaphysics, the decline?
I can sympathize with Heidegger's point here, in that sort of the attempt to sort of remove yourself from sort of the temporal and into sort of the metaphysical, into the beyond, can be viewed as a form of like retreat, perhaps. But other than that, I obviously I need to read up on Heidegger, to be honest.
I did, as I said, I did attempt to read Being in Time. I'm looking at my copy of it now. I've had it for years. As I went through it, I learned much more about Heidegger by reading essays on Heidegger than reading his own work, because the language is so clunky and hard to understand. And I know Heidegger is very concerned with language and the ideas of the limitations of language as a means of communication. And I know other people who say you can't understand Heidegger properly unless you read it in the original German anyway. But I can't do that. So I don't. I can't say how much that metaphysics is in there, because it doesn't. It's hard to decipher what his meaning is often. But I think Greg put some good points forward. From what I understand, Evola might have been a little bit overly critical of them. But his work is pervaded with a sense of something beyond the material, something immaterial. And Dasein, I think, is a great concept of that. You know, that the way of being in the world affects your being in the world, and that means that different peoples, of course, must have unique types of being by virtue of the different historical circumstances and even the geography of their existence.
I agree, and yeah, it's. I can't help but agree with this kind of moving away from metaphysics into just analyzing man not in his thoughts in the abstract, just as he is within the world. And it's something that hasn't been uncovered enough, because he's the only philosopher who's at least, there have been others, but dealt with it properly.
Isn't Dreyfus, the Jewish guy from Berkeley, is philosopher who continued that tradition? I've not read Dreyfus either, but he's meant to be one of the 20th century's latter 20th century's foremost Heideggerian philosophers.
Either way, I think the ontological investigation of Heidegger is well worth the read, even though the book actually was never finished. There's meant to be another part, but that's all I have to say on it.
Well, let's continue then to on the dual aspect of anonymity. Leto, would you care to read some of these passages out?
Sure. Thus, a problem presents itself, one that cannot simply be solved by the facile polemic against the collectivism, mechanization, standardization, and solace of modern existence. Moreover, we must make it very clear. What exactly is to be saved? Today's intellectuals who have at heart the defense of the personality give no satisfactory reply, because they hold on to what I have called the regime of residual forms, and almost without exception they think and evaluate in terms of liberalism, natural law, and humanism. The true point of departure should instead be the distinction between person and individual. Strictly speaking, the concept of the individual is that of the abstract formless numerical unity. As such, the individual has no quality of its own, hence nothing that really distinguishes it. Considered simply as individuals, one can assume that all men and women are equal, so that we can ascribe equal rights and responsibilities to them, and presumably equal dignity. As human beings, the concept of human being is only a dignified version of that of the individual. In social terms, this defines the existential level proper to natural rights, liberalism, individualism, and absolute democracy. One of the principal and most apparent aspects of modern decadence refers, in fact, to the advent of individualism as a consequence of the collapse and destruction of the former organic and traditionally hierarchical structures, which has been replaced primarily by the atomic multiplicity of individuals in the world of quantity, that is to say, the masses. In fact, in the West, there has been a collision between individualism, subjectivism, and personality that goes back to the Renaissance period, and which developed in the light of the discovery of man, exalted by anti-traditional historiography. Historians have carefully ignored or considered as positive the counterpart, that is, the more or less conscious and complete separation from transcendence. All the splendor and power of creativity of that period should not bind us to this basic tendency. Schuon, does anyone know that name? How to pronounce it? I've seen it multiple times.
It's Schuon.
Schuon has clarified the true state of affairs regarding the artistic realm as follows. Speaking in human terms, certain Renaissance artists are without a doubt great, but their grandeur becomes insignificant when faced with the grandeur of the sacred. In the sacred, it is as if the genius is concealed. What predominates is an impersonal, vast, mysterious intelligence. The sacred work of art has a perfume of infinitude, the imprint of the absolute. The individual talent is there disciplined. It mingles with the creative function of the entire tradition, which cannot be substituted, much less surpassed, by the mere resources of man. One can say the same regarding self-affirmation. On other levels of the personality in that epoch, from the Machiavellian prince type, with its more or less perfect horizontal incarnations, to the Cornetti and demagogues, and in general all those who receive Nietzsche's approbation for their prodigious yet uninformed accumulation of power. In order to go further in our analysis, we need to leave ambiguity behind and clarify its terms, which is only possible if we restore the original and proper meaning to the term person. Originally, persona signified mask, the mask that ancient actors wore in playing a given part. in incarnating a general personage. Thereby, the mask possessed something typical, non-individual, especially in the case of divine masks, and even more clearly when used in many archaic rites. At this point, I can resume and apply these ideas of the preceding chapter about the dual structure of the being. The person is that which the man presents concretely and sensibly in the world. In this position he occupies, but always signify a form of expression and manifestation of a higher principle in which the true centre of being is to be recognised and on which falls, or should fall, the ascent of the self. Like the individual, the person itself is in a certain sense closed to the external world and in relation to it. All the existential situations whose legitimacy we have already recognised can be of value in the present age. Unlike the individual, the person is not closed to the above. The person being is not himself, but has himself, like the relation between the actor and his part. It is presence to which he is, not coalescence with that which he is. The individual is in fact made typical, that is to say, superpersonal, by virtue of the Far Eastern saying, the absolute name is no longer a name. He is likewise anonymous. Traditionally, in the higher sense, is a type of confirmation of such anonymity, or an approach to it with a particular field of action. One could even speak of the universalism and eternalization of the person, but these expressions have deteriorated through rhetoric and abstract usages that have concealed any possible concrete or existential meaning. It would be better to define the situation in question as of being in which the super-individual principle, the self, transcendence, remains conscious, and gives to the developing part, the person, the objective perfection corresponding to a given function and a given meaning. On the personal level, one is inferior to the other superior. One has for a limit the individual in the formlessness of a numerical and undifferentiated unity that through multiplication produces the anonymous mass, the other in the culmination typical of a sovereign being, the absolute person. The latter possibility rests on a foundation of active anonymity. That appears in traditional civilizations, defining a position opposed to every action, creativity, or affirmation based merely on the I. And the aforementioned conversion, apparently paradoxical, of the personal being into an impersonal being, makes itself known in the fact that a grandeur of the personality indeed exists in which the work is more visible than the creator, the objective more than the subjective, which in the human field something is reflected of that nudity and purity that belongs to the grand forces of nature, in history, art, politics, spiritual disciplines, and in the degree of existence.
Okay, there's a lot to unpack here. Let's, oh man, how do we even start this? Okay, well, the main part is Evola differentiating the two types of being, which is one is as an individual, the other as a person, right? And he links individual, or the being of an individual, with sort of the systems of sort of mass democracy, of capitalism, of communism even, and sort of views the individual as sort of an alienated sort of specter amid mass society. Whereas a person, and this sort of goes into sort of modes of sort of traditional sort of hierarchy and civilization, a person has a sort of specific role and is informed not only in the role that he exhibits and enacts, but his sort of existence is also informed by the relationship to other sort of actions and other roles. Tom, correct me if I'm wrong on any of that.
Oh no, it sounded good to me. Good assessment. Yeah, it's difficult to unpack. There's a lot of things happening.
He's elaborated this in Men Among the Ruins, but he didn't make a connection to the Renaissance, which I found was interesting, because that's like a pretty common thing within our world. If you visualize the government and the way it works, it has this process of putting people as individuals, not as persons. And he kind of he makes this kind of, if I'm correct, this distinctional fall within the Renaissance period,
Well, all sort of everyone on the NRX side of things, all of the monarchists I know highlight the beginning of the end of Western civilization with the Renaissance. Actually, it
That's the proper traditionalist perspective
yeah.
as well. In general, like from all traditionalists, um, some I mean, some people incorrectly like to see it as like a high point in a return to the greatness of the classical era, and that actually is a form of historiography popular with post-Enlightenment thinkers.
Mm.
But even like mainstream historians now, in history, when I'd learned, we never use the term Dark Ages anymore. It's total nonsense. The idea that there was like a boost in wealth in that era, the Renaissance, is not true. Even they've just had an economic study from economic department collaborating with history departments showing that even medieval England, which was about half as rich as medieval Italy, was still richer than most countries in the world today.
Mm.
And they didn't have colonialism, it didn't have industrialism, it didn't have any of these things, but it's still wealthy and perfectly comfortable place to live. And in terms of the art, and the Schuon quote is very interesting, I think, because I was in Rome in September, and the when you get to see in such close proximity the ancient classical religious art, the medieval religious art, and then the revival of classical forms into a new Christian context in the Renaissance, you can see that in many ways the Renaissance art is inferior, because although new techniques were acquired or reacquired from the classical period, they were applied in a different way, because there was still an interest in innovation, and the everything was so convention. The convention of classical art, classical styles was in Greece and Rome all about the gods. It was about portraying sacred forms,
Mm-hmm.
whereas there were more abstract ideas at play in the Renaissance revival of these. And when they depict some Old Testament Hebraic character in the same proportions and likeness as an ancient Greek god, it still isn't and you could say that was devotional, but it wasn't sincere, I don't think. And often it was more about, it was created for audiences in a totally different way. The way that art was displayed in Italy during the Renaissance period was like a public spectacle. It was very much like modern art in that sense,
Mm-hmm.
not in any way, connected to religious devotion. People weren't, burning incense for these statues, put it that way.
Well, that's
And also, sorry,
no. Go ahead.
I've
Go
had,
ahead. Finish up.
no, I said enough. It's okay.
Oh no, well, you hit on something that is really important to sort of to discuss in terms of sort of the problems with the Renaissance, which is the emergence of the mercantile class first and foremost, and their relationship to art, which is patronage, which directly counters what you were saying, Tom, which is that the transmutation of art as sacred, as art as worship, to art as sort of a financial sort of way of displaying power.
Yeah. I mean, medieval churches and pagan temples of Rome also display power,
Mm.
but they're meant to display the power of the
Of the
gods, or
divine,
of
yeah.
God, or of
Yeah.
divinity, not of temporal powers. And even you can see in, I mean, medieval churches around Europe, like, I mean, there are people there are patrons and important families who are involved, and their contribution is that they get a they get a tomb there, and they say they gave some money to help it, but the building is not to show their power, it's to show the power of God, and their inclusion in it is to show their devotion, their which is obviously that's different from the classical thing, because classical religion didn't have that devotional aspect. But yeah, Renaissance art can be very beautiful, especially much more beautiful than any modern art. And the techniques were some extraordinarily talented techniques, but it is lacking in that sense. Even when you can travel to like Eastern countries and see like Hindu or Buddhist art, and sometimes you think, even medieval art, for example, where it's quite crude in comparison, there is something in it, some something transcendent, and that was what was really important. And some people very foolishly believe the reason that the medieval wooden carvings of saints are not in the realistic proportions is because that they were not capable of doing so. When you look at the buildings that they're contained in, you think that they were that primitive.
Yeah.
To make such an idiotic assumption that this kind of art was no longer important. It became a thing, a fashion in classical Rome to depict human gods in realistic human proportions. But that was a very unique occurrence in world history for any race to have done so. And then Europeans drifted away from it back towards medieval forms later on. But it isn't necessarily it's nothing. It doesn't mean that it's inferior art if they've used to representational forms. That's how all pagan art in Europe was as well, except for the classical.
Any other final thoughts on this, Leno? You have any?
Just to clarify,
Yeah.
So the decline of personality is a resultant of the decline of transcendence. Is that correct? It's not the other way around.
That's how I took it. Yeah.
That's how I read it. And it's obviously not referring to every single person in society has a good an aristocratic personality, but the higher ends of the beings, which have a superior personalities, is mixed among the masses until it becomes nothing. This is the kind of decline I see he's kind of putting forth here.
Well, it's interesting that throughout the book, Evola sort of mentions certainly in the later passages, sort of like Marxist critique and Marxist sort of philosophy as a means of sort of answering what Evola is trying to answer here, which is namely like alienation and sort of despair from that. And it is interesting that, again, we've always sort of said that the sort of the Marxist critique of capital is inherently a bourgeois sort of sentiment. It's a middle class sentiment because it primarily is concerned with sort of material possessions and material happiness, whereas Evola sort of steps beyond that and sort of addresses that like material concerns are they're not the they're not the root of a way of being or even of a civilization, that it is actually linked to the transcendent. It's linked to the spiritual, and I think that's kind of the sort of the main takeaway that I had of this book, and also obviously the main differentiation between sort of the dissident right and the left, or even you can even posit the dissident right and everyone else, because our concerns are predominantly spiritual and not material.
That's not to say I know a lot of people within the right wing are not into spirituality at all. It's not to say the left wing is the proper materialist view on life. I still think it's got many problems within it.
Well, no, I think it's primarily focused on the material way of life, though, and it's informed via materialism, inherently to its root. Whereas the root of, irregardless of whether or not you're a practicing Christian or a Catholic, if you're on the dissident right, you have a spiritual conception of civilization. You believe in something greater, more of yourself, even if it is rooted in materialism, the importance of blood or whatnot. You can imbue sort of the importance of blood and the vitality of a people through spiritual and mythological means.
Yeah.
But let's continue here. This is the destructions and liberations in the new realism. Tom, do you care to read these passages out?
Certainly. It is said that the crisis of individual and personal values seems destined to become an irreversible process throughout the modern world, despite the existence of residual oases or reservations that withdraw into culture and empty ideologies and still accord to these values a semblance of life. In practice, the mortal blow to the individual has not been dealt by materialism alone, by the world of the masses and modern metropolises, but even more by the realm of technology. By elementary energies reawakened and controlled in objective processes. Also, the existential effects of collective catastrophic experiences, such as total warfare with all its cold destruction, have acted in a dehumanizing way, eliminating everything from the old bourgeois world that was varied, personal, subjective, arbitrary, and intimate. Jung himself refers to that which sometimes manifested in recent times in extreme, life-threatening situations, mainly in modern warfare, in the material battle, in which technology seems to turn against man with its systematic destruction and its activation of elementary forces. The individual as combatant cannot face it without being blown apart, not only physically but spiritually, unless he passes into a new form of existence. This form is characterized by two things. First, by an extreme lucidity and objectivity, and second, by a capacity to act and stay upright that is drawn from profound forces. Beyond the categories of the individual, of ideals, of values, and of the goals of bourgeois civilization, what is important here is a natural union of life with risk, beyond the instinct of self-preservation, including situations in which one's own physical destruction is parallel to the attainment of the absolute sense of existence and actualizes the absolute person. We might call this the ultimate case of riding the tiger. Jung believed that he could recognize a symbol of the style in the unknown soldier, adding there are not only unknown soldiers but also unknown officers. Apart from situations of which no report ever comes to light, anonymous actions at the limits of the life of the physical individual that remain without spectators and have no pretense to recognition or glory, nor are attributable to a romantic heroism apart from these. Jung showed that through processes of this kind, men of a recognizably new type often tend to take form and differentiate themselves not only by their behavior but by their physical traits, their mask. This modern type contains the destruction within himself and is no longer comprehensible in terms of the individual. He is outside the values of humanism. On this plane, one can define a realism that signifies coolness, clarity, seriousness, and purity. Detachment from the world of sentimentalism, of ego problems, of melodramatic tragedy, of the whole legacy of twilight romanticism, idealism, and expressionism. A realism that entails a sense of the vanity of the I and of believing oneself important as an individual. Matzke wrote, "We are objective because for us the reality of things is great, infinite, and everything human is too small, limited, and polluted with soul." He spoke of the language of things and actions to be substituted for that of feelings, of an inner form that has nothing to do with books, culture, or science, so that it can be more precise in the barbarian than in the civilized being of the bourgeois world. I must emphasize that this attitude is based neither on pessimism nor on a concealed philosophy of desperation. It is not concerned with values and goals that it now recognizes as illusory, or with its impotence to control reality or its own inadequacy. The very sense of these values and goals is non-existence, leaving action to be free in a pure and cool atmosphere. I have treated the new realism with the reservation that what is of value in it is generally out of sight. But now that this is pointed out, it is best to draw a clear demarcation between the realism that may contain this potential significance and its subproducts of neorealism and Marxist realism that belong to the ambitus of pure nihilism, not least because there have been collisions between the different types. Generally speaking, the second type has manifested almost exclusively in the domain of art and literary criticism, and as a function of politics. It is hardly worth dwelling on the neo-realism that surfaced after World War II. It was characterized by the tendency in the artistic field to present as human reality only the most trivial and wretched sides of existence, mostly relating to the lowest and most vulnerable social strata. The whole pose exhausted itself in a single phase. It appeared wanting in any dimension of depth, even virtual depth, and served as a sophisticated formula for certain intellectuals disguised as common folk. When it was not reiterating banalities about the pathos of wretched people, it often took pleasure in ugliness and in masochism, in the complacent depiction of everything most abject, corrupt, and defeated in man. There is a whole genre of novels, unnecessary to name by title, in which this tendency appears undisguised, sometimes in combination with the most irrational and dark side of existentialism. The truth, as we know, is that the realism in question draws its specific character from the theory of historical materialism and from other conceptions that, while they aspire to being objective and scientific, in fact contain just as much mythology as and mere social ideology as is found in those great despised words written in capital letters of bourgeois idealism. Words of this kind are not eliminated from the underpinnings of the Marxist New Realism, but replaced by others of a still lower level. They form the center of a mystic nihilism, sui generis, through their translation into energized ideas made to work on the sub-intellectual strata of the masses. This is enough to deprive Marxist realism of any realistic character, and to show that it is far from having reached the 0 point of values.
Right. So here, Evola discusses sort of the realism of the right versus sort of the Marxist, well, what is popularly known as social realism or socialist realism, which can be found in sort of Stalinism, the novels of Stalinist Russia, and of the films of sort of the noble peasant and the like. Um, Junger is probably the best example of sort of realism as seen of the right, and we can obviously a shameless plug for our 2 episodes on Junger, specifically his the episode in which we discuss his essays on pain, because in that you can find not only the right's answer to sort of alienation, the right's answer to sort of mass society, which is, in Junger's sort of philosophy, the adaptation of sort of the heroic via stoicism, via detachment, and not detachment in the sense of sort of nihilism, which can be found, as Evola states, in sort of the Marxist sort of conception of this, but in a detachment in which one is no longer concerned with sort of the bourgeois sentimentalities of being. Whereas the Marxist sort of conception of social realism is totally obsessed with the bourgeois sentiment of being, and it just sort of imparts those goals and those sort of purviews of existence onto sort of the peasant and lower classes.
Yep, I'd agree. Junger is probably the best example we can go with, and then it's in terms of moving past this bourgeoisie. I like the words of Jonathan Bowden. Like, we're stepping over it. Like, we've found a meaning better than this bourgeoisie existence. This Junger attitude towards life and pain, and this disdain for the materialism. Well, it is based in materialism, but a sense of adventure and, I hate to use the term, but Dionysian, Nietzschean in a way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That tendency for socialist realism is, I mean, it's died out even in the left.
Yeah.
It's been replaced by another thing, because it basically took the heroic, archetype and put that mask onto the body of a peasant or the worker. It idealizes the lowest aspects of society. But that was something I says after World War II, I guess, in Stalinist. But I think you're going to see it even in, I mean, National Socialist Germany have some aspects of that too.
That's true. Absolutely. I mean, that's like one of the more ridiculous elements of National Socialist Germany, and this is just sort of a historical example of it, was that they would give postal workers ceremonial daggers, right? There's no need for that. I mean, it's just sort of silly. It's just silliness, to be honest. No, there's nothing heroic about delivering the mail. Sorry, lads.
You haven't seen the film Postman with Kevin Costner?
Oh, no, I haven't. No.
The post-apocalyptic world, which has brought America, and he tries to reunite it by becoming a postman and re-establishing America. It's very silly indeed.
I always drew the connection because it wasn't Hitler in the early stages of World War One, like a message deliverer.
Yep,
I can't remember the exact name.
Yep,
his position, yeah. That's where he got it from, I guess. I don't know.
Well, it's slightly different, delivering messages between Strasses is certainly different from trench lines, but I suppose one can draw a linkage between those two, certainly.
But I think also part of his ideology, more of like his love of Germany, even the lowest peasant. That's where I got it from. Mm-hmm. Even the lowest person he cared for in his own way.
Well, I mean, this is
whether it's good or not.
Well, this is, yeah. I mean, it's again highlights the distinction between National Socialism, which is a philosophy rooted in the Enlightenment, versus Evolean anti-Enlightenment traditionalism with a capital T. But what other anything else? Any thoughts on this section, gentlemen?
I'm good.
No. Yep. All right. Very good. Okay, so I will continue on to discuss sort of the next section of this, which is the animal ideal, which is the sentiment of nature. The transcendent dimension may also become active in reaction to the processes responsible for a steady erosion of many ties to nature, leading to a rootless state. It is evident, for example, that the stay-at-home bourgeois lifestyle is increasingly and irreversibly affected by the progress of communication technology, opening up great expanses on land, sea, and air. Modern life takes place even less in a protected and self-contained qualitative and organic environment. One is immersed in the entire world by new and rapid travel that can bring us to faraway lands and landscapes in little time. Hence, we tend towards a general cosmopolitanism as quote-unquote world citizens in a material and objective sense, not an ideological, much less a humanitarian one. At least the times of provincialism are over. Given that the speed factor has an essential role in the modern technical mastery of distances, a passing allusion could be made to the value of the experience of speed itself. It is well known that today it is used by many men, and even women, almost like alcohol, to obtain a physical intoxication that feeds an essentially physical, needing distraction from unpleasant thoughts and drugging itself with strong emotions. Like the machine itself, some situations of speed in the technologicized world can have a virtual, symbolic, and even realizable dimension, often involving risk. The greater the speed, the more it requires a superior lucidity, bringing into play a higher type of calmness and internal immobility. In this context, the intoxication of speed can even change its nature. It can pass from one plane to another and have some traits in common with the type of intoxication of which I have spoken describing the state of integrarized Dionysiism. The defining and spread of Darwinism and evolutionism were already barometric indicators of this inner attitude. But apart from the domain of theories and science in the field of ordinary modern life, it is manifested in terms of behavior, given rise to what has been called the animal ideal, specifically referring to North America, where it was first realized. The term applies to that ideal of biological well-being, comfort, optimistic euphoria, emphasizing everything that is sheer health, youth, physical vigor, security, and material success, primitive satisfaction to hunger and sexual desire, athletic life, and so forth, whose counterpart to the atrophy of every superior form of sensibility and interest. I have already treated this. The kind of man who is thus elevated to the summit of modern civilization is evidently one who has developed only the aspects through which he belongs to an animal species. It goes without saying that this idea finds its counterpart in the nihilism that underlies many of today's predominant socio-political currents. Here I only want to emphasize the quote-unquote back to nature idea as an instance of the physical cult of personality. It is not only a matter of mere forms, legitimate but banal, of organic compensation. It is no wonder that today's man feels a need for physical reintegration, relaxation of nerves, and invigoration of the body away from the environment of large, modern cities. For this reason, natural living, the culture of the body, and even certain types of individual sport may be useful. Things appear otherwise, however, when people start to claim that some kind of spiritual factor is involved. That is, when it is through that natural surroundings and physical strength can make a man feel closer to himself than in the experiences and tensions of civilized life, and above all, when it is supposed that physical sensations of well-being and comfort may have any profound significance, or anything to do with human integrity, considered from a higher point of view. This is the sense in which nature can speak to us of transcendence. Our attention automatically shifts from some principal aspects of nature to others that are more propitious for opening us up to the non-human and non-individual. Nietzsche spoke of the superiority of the inorganic world, calling it spirituality without individuality. For a supreme clarification of existence, he refers to an analogy of the pure atmosphere of the Alps and ice fields, where there are no more clouds or veils, where the elementary qualities of things are revealed naked and uncompromising, but with absolute intelligibility. One hears the immense ciphered language of existence, the doctrine of becoming made stone. To return the world to a calm, stable, clear, and cool state, to resort to its elementary and self-contained grandeur, this was also said to be the demand of the new objectivity. Here, prominence was justly given not to insensibility, but to a different kind of sensibility. Also for us, it is a matter of a human type whom nature no longer interests by offering him what is artistic, rare, characteristic. He who no longer seeks in nature the beauty that merely feeds confused nostalgias and speaks to fantasy. For this human type, there can be no landscape more beautiful than another. But some landscapes can become more distant, boundless, calm, cool, harsh, and primordial than others. He hears the language of things of the world not among trees, brooks, beautiful gardens, before oleographic sunsets and romantic moonlight, but rather in deserts, rocks, steppes, glaciers, murky Nordic fjords, and the implacable tropical sun. Great ocean currents, in fact, in everything primordial and inaccessible.
I really love that section. It's quite important as well because so many modern neo-pagans of the right and the left have adopted uncritically the romanticist perspectives on nature of Rousseau's ideas. And they're so far from how any traditional or even pre-traditional societies, like primitive men, don't have that view. Primitive men don't look out at great vistas and with nostalgic thoughts. They see that kind of view the same way a dog would see it. It's just completely disinterested. It's simply an environment. And the traditional man, the higher man, the differentiated man, sees in nature the opportunity for challenges. And so things like grand, huge, immense tropical jungles or mountains to climb, things like that. Evola was himself an alpine mountaineer, of course. These represent these challenges, and certainly proper paganism was never about worshipping nature for like, beauty or the sublime, this Victorian notion of the sublime,
Right.
like a tranquil little pond or whatever. They didn't think like that at all. Anything that was great in nature was that it was symbolic of something beyond nature. Even thunder itself being symbolic of a force, of Thor embodying, the metaphysical concept of strength and power itself, not merely the physical phenomena, or the idea of when people say that pagans worship trees betrays an utter ignorance of paganism and of traditional perspectives.
No, I think that distinction made is perfect, and the two outcomes of one being the superior kind of method of existence, and what Evola is kind of implicitly putting forth is the animal ideal is in connection with his evolution, this descendant into apes, into monkeys, into primitive people.
It also seems I mean it's slightly humorous, sort of the sort of contradiction of sort of going out in nature and sort of sort of like kind of like fetishizing it, and instead of actually sort of I don't know, I think you sort of said, Tom, like sort of like the critiquing sort of the romanticist sort of view of nature, and I don't know, it's
It's a decadence.
yeah,
It's an
there's a
indulgence.
decadence.
It's indulgence
Yeah.
and it's falsehood. I mean, even most of the people who say they love nature mean what they like. They like to post a picture of some trees on their social media. They might like to watch a documentary about dolphins. That doesn't mean they love nature at all. Most of the time, when they're confronted with nature, it's either at best an inconvenience, but more likely a source of terror, and also of to completely remove them from all the comforts of their existence, which is what they really love.
Yeah. Huh. Well, it is funny that, like the modern man, obviously, alienation from the large cities. Clearly, we can clearly sort of empathize with it. But Evola sort of just going a step further and saying, well, just because you retreat to nature doesn't really mean that you understand it, and in fact that you sort of carry on sort of the relationship that an individual has with sort of modern society. One sort of imbues that onto nature itself, and that's something that I personally I've never thought of that before. It's to unpack
It's
my strolls after work in the woods. Clearly,
it goes hand in hand with his kind of like disdain for materialism. Just it's not that he has anything against like you going out into nature or anything. It's this overemphasis on it as something like beautiful. Like,
yeah. And he's also, sorry to interrupt, but I don't know if it's in this chapter or another part of the book, where he talks about that a real man of tradition, a differentiated individual, should feel as comfortable in any huge city, any grand like metropolis of the modern world, as he would in a desert or a jungle or anywhere, because ultimately all the discomforts that those environments, the respective discomforts that each environment poses, are challenges for a differentiated man. And I mean, I lived for 9 years in the most multicultural, but it was monocultural area, but the most Tower Hamlets in London, where indigenous people are less than something like 30% of the population, and sometimes I felt like I needed to escape and get out to the woods, but that was in many ways a decadent and a retreat from something. But I learned to feel that to feel at home there as well, to feel like that whatever challenges this existence the material existence, my material existence and my circumstances might pose, are to be met with a raised chin and a brave face.
Riding the tiger, so to speak.
Yeah, right.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly it. Yeah.
Very good.
If you're contaminate, you can't allow it to contaminate you spiritually. Then if you hold within yourself, if you can, whatever the tranquility, the sense of tranquility that you feel when you escape from that, you need to be able to hold that at all times, regardless of where you are.
And just aside from nature, I'm pretty sure it was in this paragraph you mentioned kind of the athleticism and the kind of well, he doesn't specifically the athletic life and so forth, and sexual desire and hunger. It's the same as well, an overemphasis on materialism compared to that of something superior. It's more than just limited to nature. This viewpoint.
And that's he's not saying don't lift and be fit, gentlemen. We all need to be in shape, but it's just don't obsess over it.
Don't have sex either.
When you're lifting to make your muscles big, you're also lifting. You're not just making yourself strong in the literal sense. You're doing it because you embrace the discomfort of lifting. You embrace it as a challenge, and then it becomes a heroic act and not a vain act.
Right.
I also think the position of like using it as a tool to prepare yourself for a challenge is also a valid method as well as this just natural natural wanting of a challenge or a struggle.
Yes.
Let's move on, gentlemen, to part 6. And Leto, you care to do the sickness of European culture?
Sure. In Europe, this process of dissolution, which always follows the disappearance of any higher point of reference, had two connect causes. The first was a kind of paralysis of the idea of European tradition as a centre of gravity, which also corresponded to an obscuration, materializing, and decline of the empire and its authority. Then, as if by counterpoint, there ensued the second cause, the centrifugal motion of the parts, the disassociation and autonomization of partial areas, conditioned precisely by the weakening and disappearance of the originating force of gravity. From the political point of view, there was the well-known consequence that we do not dwell on, the end of the unified whole that the preceding European world still presented politically and socially, despite a system of ample, regional, autonomous, and multiple tensions. It is in that which an unique idea, the basic and central symbol of a given civilization, shows its strength and exerts a parallel positive action, often invisible both on the political plane, with all the values, not just the material ones, that should concern every true state, and on that of thought, culture, and the arts. It excludes any major schism or antagonism between the two realms, as well as any need for an outside interventions. Precisely because an organic type of civilization no longer exists, precisely because the process of dissolution had penetrated every realm of existence. All of that has ceased to exist. Today we seem fated to have the alternative, false and deleterious in itself, of either a neutral art and culture devoid of any higher warrant or meaning, or of an art and culture subject to pure and simple degraded political forces, as in the case in totalitarian systems, and chiefly in those informed by the theories of Marxist realism, and the corresponding polemic against decadence and alienation of bourgeoisie art. The separation of art and culture is a direct consequence of subjectivism, the disappearance of any objective and impersonal style, and the general lack of the dimension of depth. Following what has already been stated in broad terms about the values of the personality and overcoming them, what remains to be added is a summary of examination of the most recent forms that neutral art has given rise to, in order to take stock of the situation. So this is a bit more informative than just like giving like, oh, art's just declining along with the the natural political regime of Europe. He kind of he puts forward this idea of like this gravitational force of an empire having an influence over having like an overarching influence on art, and this is like a superior method of it existing compared to like a subjective method which is present today.
Yeah, this is something that anyone living has never really had the experience of a society that had a healthy relationship to sort of its culture and to its art. Sadly, living in the post-war, and one could even argue that this was hard to find even in sort of the age of modernism. But this is a way of civilization that is totally alien to us, sadly.
Yeah, I agree with the point of like it having like a center of gravity, but when he uses the term empire, he's referring to like a total European empire, which is what was his end goal ultimately. I don't think it necessarily has to be that. I think the big like because the uniting of Europe is seen as something great, but you don't want to lose the individual sections of each part between like difference between France, Germany, and all the eastern eastern countries as well.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure if I totally buy into this.
Yeah,
The empire section. I agree with the center of gravity and the rejection of subjectivism outside of that, but not the empire word exactly. It's my problem.
No, I would agree with you on that. I read that as I mean, like honestly, like the only sort of historical sort of example that I'm sure he's using here is that of the Roman Empire, and even going farther back, you can argue Alexander, and sort of the effects of sort of culture, sort of like this, sort of the Hellenism of culture and certainly architecture and the like, but yeah, there are very few examples of having a very few examples outside of sort of classical antiquity that we can find sort of this. I mean, you can sort of view it in sort of Victorian England, but there wasn't a totality to it.
It's hard to kind of like evaluate it because we don't have much of an example.
Yeah.
He just puts something out there, which seems to have valid points, but I can't really speak of the validity of it.
Let's continue on to the dissolution in modern art. I'll read this section out. Dissolution in modern art. There is no need in speaking of the current desire to hold on to traditional art. Today, no one has any idea what can rightly be called traditional in a higher sense. We find here only academicism and the withered reproduction of models, which lack any creative force. It is variety of the regime of residuals in so-called great art, relegated to the past, is merely the stuff of rhetoric. In the opposite, avant-garde trend, value and meaning are reduced to those of a revolt and an illustration of a general process of dissolution. These works are often interesting, not from an artistic point of view, but rather as it indicates of the climate of modern life. They reflect the critical situation already alluded to in speaking of European nihilism, which gives rise to nothing constructive, permanent, or durable. Having mentioned social problems, I must also squelch the claims, or more accurately, the aesthetic and artistic ambitions of Marxist realism. Marxist critic condemns the bourgeois novel as a phenomenon of alienation. But as I've already said, the intent of giving a social content or interpretation to the narrative, specifically mirroring the dialectic evolution of classes, the impulse of the proletariat, and so on, is merely a simian parody of realism and the organic integration of the divided and neutral culture. Here one kind of disassociation is replaced by another, more serious one, that of making a socioeconomic element an absolute, detached from the rest. Social problems are, in themselves, of as little interest and importance as those of personal relationships and fetishist sentimentalities. None of these touches the essence. They fall short of what might be the object of fiction and of high art in an organic civilization. We can draw an analogy with the attitude towards art in general to that of the differentiated man, looking to a new freedom, can assume in this period of dissolution. He is very little interested in or preoccupied with the current crisis of art, just as he sees no valid, authentic knowledge in modern science. Similarly, he recognizes no spiritual value in the art that has taken shape in the modern era through the processes mentioned at the beginning of this chapter. He sees no substitute for the meaning that can be kindled by direct contact with reality in a cool, clear, and essential climate.
That last section it's just even more obvious in today's climate.
Mm-hmm.
The difference between today's art and I'm not sure the exact date where this is written. Prior to the baby boomers or whatever, something like post World War II, I'm guessing. But it's so obvious at this point. I don't really think like. Well, sorry, I've lost my train of thought.
That's all right. No, I mean it's stands testament to modern art, to what is, or at least what is titled art, is that there's no connection. There's no normal person seeks to go to a modern art exhibit. The only people who are drawn to it are either Jews of blood or spiritual Jews, to be perfectly honest. I mean, who would ever want to view and experience a Jackson Pollock? What kind of person does that? It's no one I would want to associate with.
And just remember my point. He says the modern man has no recognition of this, and just continues on his existence. That's. I don't know in today's climate whether I think they actually do acknowledge it, and it's something they're just pushing forward an even further decadence. That their aim is actual decadence. It isn't something creating beauty. It's devolved into something just an abomination of what true art is meant to be.
Oh yeah, well, it's just it's the negation of all of the European ideals and theories of art and what art is meant to convey. And because of that negation, it has sort of reliquated itself away from the commons, right? Like I said, like, who goes to art museums anymore? No one does. And the only in most circumstances, the only time art is brought up sort of in public conversation is sort of through sort of snide, like a snide rejection of it. Oh, like these crazy artists, they're, using, blood from tampons to paint something. How stupid is that? Like that's the only sort of recourse that art has in conversation now, within sort of predominant culture, within mass culture even. So
he mentioned, I'm not sure if it wasn't in this section, but previously surrealism. So we kind of have this modern art view, and then we kind of have our Renaissance, which a lot of people admire, but Vollard seems to think it's part of something decadent. I'm a bit iffy on that part, and then he has his true art, which is something even more ancient beyond that. And this surrealist modern movement tried to he kind of praises it in a way because it doesn't take on this realistic nature. It tries to make something outside the physical world.
Mm-hmm.
But in his conclusion, he just states that it became a failure. It just consumed itself to materialism and so forth. I think he had the exact same conception with Dadaism.
Yeah, well,
Initially, he thought it as something surreal and something at the same time not existent with reality, but a way to kind of horrify the bourgeoisie, or at least make life impractical for them.
Well, I've been trying to actually like read into Dadaism as an art movement because of Evola and Evola's involvement within that scene, and unsurprisingly, he was the only like non-communist Dadaist, like at all,
Yeah.
that I could find. Everyone else was were literal communists, and I mean it speaks to, I think, Evola's sort of genius in that like the motives that he wanted to use in employing Dadaism is sort of his attempts to, like as you said, to sort of alienate and confuse the bourgeoisie and sort of break apart
The modern sentiment.
the modern sentiment of art. Whereas, all the other Dadaists were just concerned about like furthering alienation for its own sake. So it's I would suggest folks look into Dadaism. It is an interesting.
If you've watched the video online, the YouTube video where he's commenting on it, he says within the particular exhibition he held, they would write purposely weird things under their painting to kind of confuse the bourgeoisie. Like sentences like, "The real Dadaist doesn't believe in Dadaism," or something. Dadaism like stockings.
Yeah.
It's just weird. Yeah. And his conclusion is, it was obviously like people came to the shows with rotten eggs and just like trashing his art. But the whole point was a real deep underlying meaning of how screwed up the current climate of the world was, and this kind of deep mystification behind it.
No, absolutely.
And you compare that to like his explanation of it compared to like a communist, like, oh, down with the bourgeoisie. It's just like another. You've taken like a step forward in a correct direction, but you've just like embodied yourself in more materialism.
Yeah. Well, speaking of terrible art, care to go into jazz music, my friend?
It is no oversimplification to say that the most modern Western music has been characterized by an even more distinct separation from its origin, whether in melodramatic, melodious, pretentious, heroic romanticism, most recently in the line represented by Wagnerism, or in tragic pathos, we need only refer to Beethoven's usual ideas. The separation has been realized through two developments, only apparently opposed. The first is intellectualism, in which the cerebral element prevails with an interest focus on harmony, often leading to a technical radicalism to the detriment of immediacy and sentiment, resulting in abstract, rhythmic, harmonic constructs that often seem to be ends in themselves. The second is the physical character found in the most recent music. The term has already been used for a music most symphonic and descriptive, that returns in a certain sense to nature, removing itself from the subjective world of pathos, and is inclined to draw its principal inspiration from the world of things, actions, and elementary impulses. Jazz reflects the same tendency as early Stravinsky, in terms of the pure, rhythmic, or syncopated element, apart from its element of song. It is a physical music that does not stop at the soul, but directly arouses and stirs the body. This is quite different from the early European dance music. In fact, the very gracefulness, impetus, movement, and sensibility permeating those dances, for example, the Viennese or English waltz, and even the tango, are substituted in jazz by something mechanical, disjointed, altogether primitively aesthetic, and even paradoxical through the use of constant repetition. According to one of the scholars of Afro-Cuban music, Fernando Ortiz, ortiz, all the primary elements of modern dance actually have these origins, including those whose origins are obscured by the fact that they have come through Latin America. One can deduce that modern man, especially North American man, has regressed to primitivism in choosing, assimilating, and developing a music of such primitive qualities as Negro music, which was even originally associated with dark forms of ecstasy.
There is the nigrification of culture, starting all the way back to jazz. Which was, I really don't have much to say. I mean, it is all sort of self-evident for me, to me at least. Do you have any?
Yeah. I'm not like any artist or anything within the music industry, so I can't really comment. It's not my forte, but the degeneration of Sodikin is quite obvious.
Yes.
He's only referring to jazz. Imagine it now. It's just like just something ridiculous. Especially, I think he uses the term repetitive noises and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
It's abstract in nature, and as well, he doesn't comment on it, but he probably would have elsewhere. The inclusion of like a sexual element to all of it.
Yeah.
So in modern terms, it's just like another degeneration of it.
Well, it's sort of musical Dionysianism, right? It's just sort of animalistic.
Yes, in a way, but I still.
It's imbuing it with.
It's not even Dionysian. It's just disgusting. Yeah. Like if I played like Wagner to the one of the songs and compared that to something, I don't know, Nicki Minaj or whatever, which is more Dionysian in your opinion?
Oh man, probably Nicki Minaj, right? It's just pure animalism, right? I'm speaking like Dionysianism and sort of like Bacchanalia, like.
We kind of have two different opinions on the actual word, because as me, like an inspiration, the Wagner obviously is much more superior.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely.
It affects me, but yes, if you put it on a natural, like animal existence, sure, the one with the beats and the weird shit is obviously the more Dionysian one.
Well, that's all right. Well, speaking of weird shit, I guess we should continue on to excursus on drugs, perhaps. This is from the text. Going beyond music and dance, we are led to an even larger and more problematic realm, which embraces many other methods being increasingly used by a younger generation. The North American beat generation, in putting together alcohol and sexual orgasm, and drugs as essential ingredients to give them a sense of life, radically associated techniques that in reality have a common background, which I have alluded to earlier. The increasing spread of drugs among today's youth is a significant phenomenon. A specialist, Dr. Laennec, writes, "In our lands, the most widespread category of drug addicts is represented by the neurotics and psychopaths, for whom the drug is not only a luxury, but an essential food, the response to anguish. Toxic mania now appears as an additional symptom of the patient's neurotic syndrome. One symptom, among others, a last defense, soon becoming the one and only defense." With drugs, we have a situation similar to that of syncopated music. Both were often transpositions onto the profane and physical plane of means that were originally used to open up to the super sensible in initiation rites or similar experiences. Just as dances to modern syncopated music derive from a static Negro dance, the various drugs used today and created in laboratories correspond to drugs that were often used for sacred ends in primitive populations, according to ancient traditions. In general, one must keep in mind that drug use, even for a spiritual end, that is, to catch glimpses of transcendence, has its price. How drugs produce certain psychic effects has not yet been determined by modern science. It is said that some, like LSD, destroy certain brain cells. One point is certain. Habitual use of drugs brings a certain psychic disorganization. One should substitute for them the power of attaining analogous states through one's own means.
One of the more controversial chapters of the book, he's not, yeah, well, it's pretty obvious. He's not saying go out and do drugs, or like he's kind of giving like this idea that in some instances an individual who's willing to take like a leap of faith or an adventure on certain types of drugs to go on some spiritual journey is somewhat acceptable. I don't really buy into it. I understand the argument, but for me, even like it's a very few minute amount of people this applies to. Majority of people use this as an excuse to go out and take LSD.
Yeah. Yeah, and it isn't even for like they can say that it's for transcendence, but that's just I don't even think that these people really have a firm understanding of transcendence. They just want to experience something not ordinary, and they sort of confuse the two.
I have done it a couple of times before, and it doesn't give you any transcendence. It just fucks with your head repeatedly. It's not. You don't get anything out of it, in my opinion, unless like the reference is kind of to like even to like primitive tribes who kind of like use the drug as like an experience to overcome something within their society. Even that I see as like a decadence. That's like, why would you want to be something like that?
Yeah, but I've
it's an exclusive way of opening yourself in a way.
No, it's in full disclosure, I've never taken LSD, but I've taken mushrooms a few times, and where I sort of mirror your points, Leto. It's just kind of fucks you up. But I can sort of understand that, when you're not either with like your friends or like in your room, if you're being sort of in the middle of a ritual, when you have a very explicit sort of religious and spiritual sort of avenue to travel down, then yeah, I can see the utility of that, because it does, like psilocybin mushrooms, like definitely, I obviously do not endorse such actions here on Kulturkampf. Absolutely not. But
it's obvious, like not included with any Christian spirituality, but I think there is some connections to paganism within the. I think the Nordic had something to do with mushrooms. I can't remember correctly.
Yeah, well, it's believed, and Tom sadly had to leave us, so he would correct me if I'm wrong here. But it is, from my understanding, it's believed that the Norse berserkers imbibed mushrooms before joining to battle, and I'm sure that there were other rituals that they were used, but for at least my understanding, that the berserkers were tripping balls, to use the term.
I don't know how you could do that. I couldn't even get my car in my driveway.
Oh God, no! Yeah, dude, I was enamored with the floral patterns of my carpet for a good 6 hours. So I was I did not learn anything new other than a deeper appreciation for my carpet.
Yeah, maybe relating it to the modern world in a sense, like someone who's just completely content with the physical world and is trying to find a willing experiment to kind of shift one's perspective, I guess is the right term, but I wouldn't advocate it at the same time.
No, we strictly say no to drugs podcast, ladies and gentlemen, for those who are listening. So stay off the beaten trails in terms of that.
And this is like he's correct. I mean, I'm wrong, but he's like specifically identifying these hallucinogenics. No way any like those, like pot, for example, just like lower yourself into just boredom and, well, not boredom, but
laziness.
Yeah, laziness is the right word.
Absolutely. Well, let's continue on here. After discussion of drugs, one can only speak of death. So let's close it out with that, Leto. You mind reading the final passage?
Sure. Facing the idea of death, the end of a person, the differentiated man's first test naturally refers to establishing in the self the incapacity for the anguish that, according to Heidegger, one should have the courage to feel, while also discounting all those prospects of the beyond and those otherworldly judgments that popular forms of religion have used to control the individual by working on the sub-intellectual part of the soul. In antiquity, Lucretius made a functional, pragmatic use of something like modern atheistic science. In order to banish the fears of the beyond, he maintained the Olympic idea of the divine, but recognized the gods as distinct essences that do not interfere in the world and should be valued by the wise only as ideals for ontological perfection. These aspects could provide a positive climate in the modern world for the differentiated man, because that which has been affected only concerns a vision of humanized life devoid of the sense of greater distances. He can then consider a particular contemplation of death as a positive factor, as a challenge and a measure of his inner strength. More generally, the idea of death is a matter of surpassing an inner limit, of breaking a bond. The differentiated man no longer gives importance to staying alive or not, and leaves death behind one, so to speak, without being paralyzed by it. From this point, one should enter into a higher exalted free form of living, carried by a sort of magical lucid intoxication. Furthermore, the differentiated man cannot think that his being begins with his physical corporeal birth and ends with his death. However, he can neither make the beyond and centre of gravity of his life, as is the religious theory of salvation, nor can he regard terrestrial existence as the mere ascetic preparation for death. So, one further example he claims a bit later on is that of the Japanese kamikaze pilot. Not so much disregarding the idea of jihad and self-sacrifice, the idea that not having the angst which you have towards death is directed into a form of inner strength, of knowing that it has come, but you still stand above it. When a kamikaze pilot kind of knows any day now he could be sent out and just immediately die, in his mind he's also living like the world as if it's his last day on Earth, and still when people think of that, they think of like a destructive, like crazy nihilism, but it's more of a calm and masculine way of looking at the world.
On that, I am in full agreement. I do think that this is I think for the later stages of season 2, there is a continuing theme that permeates these episodes, and that is the necessity of detachment in heroic action and in heroic being. And I think that for this episode, and this clearly signals, I think, the crux of what Evola is getting here, specifically when he keeps on bringing up Heidegger and Heidegger's sort of theory that, to live is to die. I do, in my opinion, view that as innately aristocratic. That you sort of, in having that conception of reality, having that conception of being, one automatically has to dispense with sort of the material sort of concerns and sort of the banal materialism of contemporary society, and even further of that of just sort of normal society post-industrial revolution.
Yeah, I definitely agree, and I also want to emphasize the connection to the similarities between this and Stoicism, as well as something Evola, I think, admires in the later part of this chapter, But it is something void of his transcendental view on life, as far as I'm aware. But it's the same kind of outlook at life.
Yeah.
This not getting intoxicated, actually is the right word, within life. This emphasis of there is more above to something than life, and having this calm demeanor about it.
Or there's that there's in that detachment one can glean, and this may not be the correct word for it, but one can glean a healthy disdain for the normal sort of morality of the world. And I think utilizing this philosophy of being is definitely crucial for the dissident right as a movement. We have to have we obviously have disdain for modernity. We wouldn't be here if we didn't. But what is important is that we have to imbibe that disdain with greater meaning and sort of rise above the current confines of civilization in which we find ourselves in. I think that's the takeaway. That's the takeaway that we can get from this book.
Yeah, it's a way to act within modernity. These ideals are definitely not like like end goal or meaning to life. There's something which to help us avoid falling to dissolution.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this is our final episode of Evola for at least season 2. I'm sure we will be returning to him. Leto, you're the Kulturkampf's Evolian expert. Have any final thoughts on the man and on this book?
Recently, actually, they're releasing a couple books over at Kulturkampf. They had like a Patreon which got taken down. I think there's like a GoFundMe or something, and it managed to get through. But there is more to Evola than we actually know, so that's something to look forward to. His books were only recently translated within, I think, the last 10 or 20 years or something like that.
Something to look forward to. And as
just one last point, I hear a lot of the time the claim that he's the most right-wing thinker to ever exist. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, that's stemming from Bowden's speech on him, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I would have to agree with Bowden on this. I enjoy reading Evola, and I do think that he has sort of as preface to answering your question. He's an enjoyable read, and he should be read, obviously. But I'm as a National Socialist, I do have some serious sort of critiques of him, and considering that he does view, he has a book, National Socialism, or it's fascism viewed from the right.
There's 3 of them. There's Notes on the Third Reich, Traditionalism, Take on Fascism, and fascism viewed from the right.
From the right. So he automatically, just in the title alone, he posits himself as being to the right of fascism and National Socialism. And I would agree with that. I certainly do think that his brand of capital T traditionalism is more right wing than mine. I don't believe in a caste system, for instance. But in terms of the world's most right wing thinker, perhaps the only person that could hold a candle to him would be Joseph de Maistre, the
Godfather,
the arch monarchist, the arch absolutist. But I think those 2 certainly are probably the most far to the right that I have read, at least. What about you?
Yes, I'd agree. If you take the original sense of the distinction between left and right from the French Revolution, so Joseph de Maistre was the defense of, at least a conserve of, the pre-monarch views on the world. And if you take it in that distinction, Evola goes all the way back to even past the Renaissance in some stages
yeah,
to a decline of man.
yeah. Well, it's yeah. I mean, De Maistre speaks of the divine right of kings, and Evola speaks of divine kings. So I guess Evola would be more right wing if viewed from that paradigm. But
But I remember, I don't know if Nick said this in the show last time or after the show to me. He kind of found it funny that people like, I'm more right wing than you.
Yeah.
I've got a superior ideology. The more right wing I go, the better. That's one thing to consider. Don't just go, oh, I have to go right wing as possible in this idea. I have to find the decline as far back as I can go. It's, I think he's writing that's put forth in his magnum opus. But what's really important is his critique of the 20th century.
Yes. Yeah. That's the use. I think a lot of Evola's sort of prehistorical, one could say, writings, while they're an interesting mental exercise, I don't think that there's any sort of sane way to contextualize that into a workable philosophy for modernity, to be perfectly honest. And we've shared our we shared our critiques of Evola quite stridently in the previous episode, Men Amongst the Ruins, with our friend Nick Mason. But I would want to close, I think, on Evola with one could say a teaser for our next episode and the final episode of Kulturkampf Season 2. Julius Evola tried to create the fascist esotericism, but Mussolini was not Hitler, nor was he initiated. Rome would have been in agitation and revolt from above and below through the Christian Semitism. Unfortunately, the founder of the Group did not meet personally with Hitler, nor did he discover the key to his esotericism. Only close to that center of maximum energy could he have come to understand his visions, even after the end of the war, because nothing is over for good. We believe it is necessary to say Julius Evola, the deepest, most important Italian thinker of our time, could not manage to break free from the limits imposed upon him by his Roman birth and his admiration of René Guénon, over whom he was far superior. Those being the words of Miguel Serrano from his book Golden Thread, Esoteric Hitlerism. So join us next week when we begin our exploration of Miguel Serrano and his work Nos. So, this has been episode 58 of Kulturkampf. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, very special thank you to Tom, who sadly had to skip out midway, but we hope to have him back very soon. And until then, dear friends, hail victory.